Good evening. My name is Juliane Camfield. I'm the director here at Deutsches Haus at NYU. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to what we think is a very timely topic of conversation, journalism in troubled times. The TT should give you an indication what this was caused by. We shall not mention the name, but troubled points into the right direction, I believe. This is also our grand season finale here at Deutsches Haus to wrap up our spring semester. So I feel like we couldn't really wrap it up with a better topic. And I think it will be a cliffhanger, so we'll be back in the fall to discuss this in more detail. And we'll be back in the next several years to discuss this in more detail. For our agenda for the fall, just make a note that we'll be even more political than we've been recently for good reasons, I believe. Before we start, let me thank a few institutions and individuals. First, of course, our panelists, Masha Gessen, Jay Rosen, Marc Pitzke, and Christian Martin, who are here tonight and have made time in their busy schedules to be here with us to discuss this timely subject matter. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, who support our academic programs and have done so for almost 10 years. We're enormously grateful for their support. So thank you, DAAD. Whenever you watch that, we've thanked you and we really appreciate your support. I want to thank my colleagues here at Deutsches Haus, and I want to give a special shout out to Sarah Girner, who initiated this panel. That was a great idea, and I'm glad it's coming to fruition tonight. But I also want to thank our intern casting, our intern Steffi. It's Steffi's last day. Thank you so much. You've done a great job over the past 8 months, and we wish you all the best for your time in Germany. I also want to thank our student worker, Magnus, our photographer, John, our videographers, Laia and Isabel, and this is almost an Oscar speech, so I will wrap things up now because I can hear the orchestra playing in the back. So thank you, the audience, for coming here tonight, and if you don't speak German yet, remember, if you dare, and we have the originator of this nice slogan here among us, if you dare, please come and learn German here. You might want to do this quickly because soon you might want to emigrate to Germany when things get really ugly here. So this might be a special incentive. Our summer classes are open for registration. But this is a serious topic. I'm just trying to make things a little bit more light before it gets tough. Now, let me introduce Christian Martin to you, who will moderate this panel. He, in turn, will introduce the other speakers. We'll have the discussion that he will moderate. Afterwards, you'll have a chance to make comments, to ask questions. Please wait until they have finished their discussion, and then you will have time to ask your questions. And then we'll have an informal wine reception for more questions, because I feel there might be more questions than answers tonight, but perhaps I'm wrong. Having said that, I will now introduce Christian. He's the Max Weber Chair of German and European Studies at NYU's Center for European and Mediterranean Studies and Professor of Comparative Politics at the University of Kiel in Germany. He holds a doctorate from the University of Constance. Before joining NYU, Christian was a postdoctoral researcher at the Max Planck Institute in Jena, an assistant professor at the University of Hamburg, and a visiting assistant professor at Northwestern University. His current research project is on backlashes against globalization and EU integration. Please join me in welcoming Christian and silence your cell phones. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Juliane. Thanks for coming here. What could be more important than to talk about the truth? And to do that, we have three outstanding panelists that I will introduce now to you. To my left is Marc Pitzke, who hails from Germany but has been a New Yorker since 1993. He studied journalism at the Deutsche Journalistenschule in Munich and also here at Columbia University. He has covered every major event that has happened in this country for German language newspapers and especially Der Spiegel and Spiegel Online. Most recently, we just talked about his attending the inauguration in January of this new presidency. Then in the middle, we have Masha Gessen, who is a journalist and the author of 10 books. Most recently, The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia. It will be published in October 2017, so this year. She's also the author of the national bestseller, The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin. And she's a contributing opinion writer to the New York Times and a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books, among other publications. She has received numerous awards, among them most recently the 2017 Overseas Press Club Award for Best Commentary. She's also the vice president of PEN America. And then on my far left, Jay Rosen, who teaches journalism at NYU. He has been a member of the faculty here since 1986, and from 1999 to 2004, he was the chair of that department. He is the author of Press Think, a blog about journalism's ordeals in the age of the web, which was launched in 2003. And in 1999, he published a book with Yale University Press, What Are Journalists For?, which is about the rise of civic journalism movement. Jay holds a PhD in media studies here from NYU. We will now have 5 minutes during which each of our panelists will have the opportunity to give an opening statement on our topic tonight, and then I will follow up with a round of questions. Marc.
Hello. Okay. Thanks a lot. Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. Opening statement sounds so official. I'm just glad to be at an event with you guys. Listening what you have to say. Maybe I can contribute a little bit practical experience. We were talking earlier, we were sitting around upstairs talking about the night of the elections and the day after. And I remember very vividly, we worked till about 5 in the morning. I was sitting in the subway going home, and I was just, once the stress and the adrenaline of work had sort of lifted, I felt so defeated, not in political terms, but as a journalist. And I felt like we had failed. We had failed to see what was coming. We had failed to identify all these things we now see so clearly. And we had failed to stop something terrible from happening. And it was a feeling that didn't leave me for a while. And you go into the self-reflection and this post-mortem, and like every other magazine, we did this editorially. We talked amongst ourselves, you know, what can we do better? What did we do wrong? And what are the lessons here? And for me, in the end, it came down to my soul almost, because this is just more than just being a profession. For me as a reporter, for me as an immigrant here, this affects me in my job, this affects me as a person, how I live here, this affects everybody around me. What are the lessons here? And it was, when we were talking earlier, we said, well, can we be a little more positive than this? For me, there was a turn when we went to the inauguration, and we all had a moment in the office in Washington, and we said, oh, this is what we do and why we do this. I felt really invigorated. I felt like this is not the end of journalism. This really tells me my purpose. This really gives me, it just sort of got me out of my complacency of all these years of doing what I do. And it was a moment of looking forward. The question is now, of course, nobody trusts reporters anymore, apparently. And that's true, and that's always been true. It's gotten worse. But what does that mean? What does trust mean? I mean, there's a lot of professions that people don't trust. If you look at those polls, if you look at the scale, you find a lot of very honorable, very necessary professions that are still around that people don't trust. So should that defeat me? No, of course not. It should be the opposite. It should tell me as a reporter to be that voice that people can trust in this whole sea of white noise, for instance. Now, how do we get there? How do we approach this? How do we identify things politically that in this crazy environment where we can say, this is what you need to pay attention to. This is what you don't need to pay attention to. It's been really overwhelming, and I said earlier, I have more questions myself than answers. And I'm trying to learn, which is a good thing. When you're 54, you're trying to learn. I feel it's a good impetus to push forward and to actually achieve something. How do we do this? I made all these notes, but I can't read them because my glasses are not really working. So, no, you would have to hold them right here. It's fine. How do we achieve this? I remember after the elections, I installed one of those Twitter alerts on my phone where I get alerted every time Trump tweets something, and that thing went off every morning at 5 in the morning with some other crazy story. And I ended up turning it off because it really, it just muffled me. And it blocked my view of what's really important here. What's really behind that noise? What's really behind all the distraction? Of course, we're a magazine. We have a weekly magazine that takes a little slower approach to stories, and we have a daily web edition that is like round the clock and has to, get clicks. And so we're kind of caught in between these two mechanisms. But how do I step back as a reporter and pick the stories that are really important? Is it important to talk about, the dinner at Mar-a-Lago? No, it's not. Is it important about what we just got as a newsflash, what Trump revealed in the Oval Office to the Russians? Yes, it is. So I think we all need to take a deep breath, and I feel like academics are very important in that because they give us structure and they give us a context, historical context. And that's why I'm really excited to hear about you guys. I have lots of other things to say, but I'm sure we can sort of cover that in the questions.
I like this, the idea of starting with election night. So what happened to me on election night was that I was on standby for the op-ed page of the New York Times with a number of other international journalists who were supposed to write reactions to Hillary Clinton's victory in their countries. I didn't think she was going to win, but everybody else did, so I was on standby. And around 1:30 or 2 in the morning, I wrote to the editor on duty, who was someone I'd never worked with before, because I think the senior editors had actually gone home because they'd put together the package, the Hillary victory package, and gone home, right? So I emailed him saying, I think I should write a different piece. I think I'd like to write a piece on how to survive an autocracy. And he said, well, let's wait until the final results. said, well, you know, I can make it provisional, but I don't think the results are going to change. And he said, nah. And so I ended up sending that piece to the New York Review of Books, which ended up crashing their website several times over because it was so widely read and circulated. But it was an extraordinary moment for me to of observing, you know, this violation of a paramount rule in journalism. I mean, something that I was taught when I was 20. You never assume that something is going to happen. You never think that, you never go forward as though there were only one possibility. And so I think that if there was a failure in the coverage of the campaign, it wasn't the failure that we often talk about. It's not the failure to influence people's decision-making process. It's not the failure to project just how dire the situation was. It was a failure of imagination. And I think that we need to, going forward, we need to be exercising our imagination in a variety of different ways. And I mean, you know, imagination that reaches into the future and into the past and into the present. Right? It's all a matter of imagination. And I'll explain what I mean very specifically, right? Donald Trump, I think the most relevant thing for journalists is that Trump is a threat to the public sphere, right? There's a lot of debate about and we simply don't know how many changes he's going to be able to effect in the laws of this country and in the workings of American institutions. That remains to be seen. We've never been here before. But the changes that he's causing in the culture and in the public conversation are already observable, right? And this is where journalists can play a very, very important role. And so I think that his threats to the public sphere are basically three. One is the way he lies, because he lies not like other politicians lie. He doesn't lie in order to get you to believe something that he actually believes, and to bring you to his side. He lies to assert power, which is a different kind of lie. It's not like we haven't seen it before. We saw it with Putin, we saw it with Berlusconi. You saw it in the playground with the bullies when you were a child. You know, it's the kid who holds your lunchbox in his left hand, and you say, my lunchbox is in your left hand. He says, no, it isn't. And what are you going to do about it? That's the kind of lying that we're dealing with, right? And fact-checking is useless in that situation. It's not, you know, I'm not saying we need to discard fact-checking, but thinking of it as a powerful tool, which was part of the disappointment that a lot of journalists felt after the election, that's just misguided. You have to always be telling a bigger story about what this man is doing with his lying, right? So just saying he said this and there's no evidence for this, I think is not fulfilling our responsibility as journalists. Number two, he's a threat to language, right? He abuses language. He uses it in two different ways that that autocrats use language, right? He uses phrases and words to mean their opposite. So, for example, when he used the phrase "safe space" or "witch hunt," right? And it's a very specific kind of abuse, because he takes a phrase that has to do with power relationships and he turns it on its head, right? So he says the loser Democrats are conducting a witch hunt with their investigation into the election. Losers can't conduct a witch hunt, right? You have to have power to conduct a witch hunt. There can't be a witch hunt against the most powerful man in the world, right? And that is not just a misstatement of fact, it is an abuse of language, right? And he also, more often, just uses language by throwing words into a pile and spouting nonsense, which is actually incredibly toxic, because it constantly puts journalists, both those who are in direct conversation with him, people who are interviewing him, and those who are writing about his statements, into a position where they have to validate absolutely nonsensical word piles with interpretation and serious coverage. And I think that the response to that is not to ignore his Twitter pronouncements. I'm not saying, I think you're right to have turned off your alert, but there's this idea, let's not report on what he tweets. Of course we have to report on what he tweets, right? But the thing is not to ignore, but the thing is to be very intentional about the way we writers use language, right? And one example is, although this is intentional, but I think the intention is misguided, the way that National Public Radio refuses to use the word lie when talking about Trump, right? And their rationale, and they're on record explaining why this is, because lying is the definition of lying is intent. Somebody has to actually have the intention of misguiding you, and since they don't have a direct line to Trump's soul, if there's such a thing, then they can't know what his intent is. And I think that, and so instead they use the word misstatement. And this is where it gets really problematic, because the word misstatement is not, it also has meaning, right? The word misstatement suggests that it's an accident, that it's unintentional, that it's a singular occurrence. It's not part of a pattern. It's a word that's sort of out of time and space. And that serves to actually obscure what we're dealing with, right? And finally, the third threat that I think Trump poses to the public sphere is the most obvious, which is the way that he bypasses media, the way he disrespects media, the way that I think he's going to make good eventually on his threat to discontinue White House press briefings. I know Jay doesn't think that that's such a big loss. I actually think it is a big loss. But in any case, right, we're losing access to information for a variety of reasons. And we are also, he's also constantly undermining the credibility of the media by going around the media and constantly demonstrating we don't need that. We don't need them. They're fake. They're distributable, and all I have to say can be said in 140 characters. Right? So it's actually an attack on the very act of interpretation, which is what media are there for. But I think that means that we have to think of ourselves quite grandly as guardians of the public sphere. And I think that for that we actually have to give ourselves some pats on the back and take stock of the state of the public sphere and stop saying silly things like, oh, there's a right-wing bubble and a left-wing bubble, which is not true, right? There is a bona fide right-wing bubble. We know pretty much what it looks like. Donald Trump lives in it, right? It's people who read Breitbart and small satellites and who do not get information from sources that are in any way politically different or offer any kind of different narrative than Breitbart does, and in whose universe information basically doesn't travel, right? A majority of people in this country live in what looks like a fairly healthy public sphere. They are routinely exposed to opinions that they don't share. They actually see a wide spectrum of opinions. It's not endless. It shouldn't be endless. Right? But even if you do as little as read the New York Times, you will get angry, and you will learn answers to questions that you didn't ask. That's how the public sphere should work, and that's how it works for most people in this country. And it is not a bubble, right? And this is a thing that we need to protect. And in fact, this part of this public sphere, this part of our information universe, has been invigorated in very exciting and stimulating ways in the last few months. And I think we need to also sort of be proud of that and encourage that development. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Masha. Jay, what's your take on this? How do we protect the public sphere?
So I had some time to put together a few notes in answer to the question that you just asked me. So the title of these brief remarks is Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, Attack, Pollute, and Replace. Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, Attack, Pollute, and Replace. So I'm going to talk fast and explain what I mean by this. In 1970, a very smart economist named Albert Hirschman published a brilliant little book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. The subtitle is Responses to Decline in Firms, Organizations, and States. And his argument is that when people are dissatisfied with a company or an organization or a political party, they basically have two options. One is exit, which is leave, which is sort of a market-based solution. You exit if you don't want to buy Chevys anymore, you leave and you buy Chryslers. The market is very good at exit. Voice is when you're dissatisfied with what the company is doing, your organization is doing, your party is doing, your country is doing, you speak up. You say, this is wrong. You're mistreating us. That's voice. And these two choices, Hersman said, are complicated by loyalty. When you have loyalty, you tend to stick around even though you're dissatisfied. If you have loyalty, you are more inclined to speak up and say, you're mistreating us, or this isn't good, which gives us the notion of the loyal critic, the loyal opposition. So in baseball terms, exit is, the Chicago Cubs are terrible. I'm going to become a White Sox fan. That's exit. Voice is, Chicago Cubs, listen to your fans. They are dissatisfied with the way you're running this team. And loyalty is, what can I do? I'm a Cubs fan. I'm stuck. So we can take these terms and analyze the mainstream news media in the United States. What do people do when they are dissatisfied with the news they are getting? Well, politicized discontent with the mainstream media has a history. It basically started in 1969 with Spiro Agnew and his attacks on the mainstream media. But at that time, even though he expressed discontent for himself, for the president, for a lot of people, it was very difficult to exit from the mainstream media. You could exit from news, you could stop paying attention to the news, but wherever you turned within the news system, it was more or less the same approach to news that you met. So exit was hard. Voice, if you were dissatisfied with the news media in Spiro Agnew's day, was even harder. American journalism has always been terrible on voice, really bad. To this day, it's bad. Voice is, write a letter. Maybe we'll print it, but we probably won't. That's voice. Very weak system for registering discontent. So there was, however, some loyalty. People were loyal, for example, to Walter Cronkite. People still have a strong feeling about him. People have been loyal to other figures and institutions in news. Tim Russert comes to mind. People often say to me online, I miss Tim Russert. In New York, people are very loyal to the New York Times, even though, as Masha said, they hate it. Sometimes they get mad with it. Sometimes that's all they can talk about is how terrible it is. But they are loyal to it. People are loyal to the New Yorker, even though it piles up on their coffee table and they feel bad about not having read. You're laughing because it happens to you. So there still is loyalty among some, and loyalty is good because when there's tension in the relationship, loyalty gets you through. So exit back then was hard. Voice was pretty much impossible. Loyalty did exist, but it wore thin for people who were dissatisfied with the news system. Now let's fast forward to mid-90s. 1996, we have the birth of Fox News. 94, 95, we have the eruption of the internet into the news system. First major news sites go online around 94 or 95. And now 3 other options become available for people who are dissatisfied with the news system. The first is attack. Attack the mainstream media for its bias. Attack the mainstream media for being closed-minded. Attack the mainstream media for its perspective. And this strategy, which Roger Ailes brilliantly manipulated to create Fox News, picked up on a weakness of American journalism, which is that mainstream American journalism of the Walter Cronkite variety was a consensus product that was founded on a political consensus, the post-war consensus in the United States. But journalists convinced themselves that there was no politics to what they did, and that there was no political premises behind their professional model. And therefore, they were vulnerable to an attack on the political ideology that they had encoded into their practices, because they didn't think they encoded any ideology into their practices. Roger Ailes was very aware of this. That's why he gave birth to Fox News in 1996, and that's why he used the slogan, fair and balanced, to drive the mainstream media crazy, which it did. So attack the mainstream media as a programming strategy to create Fox News, as a merchandising opportunity to sell books like Bill O'Reilly does, and as a political mobilization tactic, which the Republican Party has used since then, was very successful. In addition to attack, later on we saw, especially the last couple of years, pollute the news system with deliberately falsified news, or what is sometimes called fake news. Pollute the news system with confusion, like who speaks for the president? Actually, no one speaks for the president. Pollute the news system with easily disproved claims, also called lying, constant lying. And when you pollute the news system, you just make it harder for people to figure out what's true, in the hope that they will give up. So that's a different strategy. When you're dissatisfied with the news system, pollute it so that people give up and withdraw. Finally, there's replace. Replace is the current strategy. That's the meaning of Breitbart. Breitbart's Washington editor Matthew Boyle recently told an Atlantic reporter, "I'm trying to build a journalistic enterprise that's designed to replace all of you." And that's the meaning of the rise of the right-wing or conservative media, is that its attempt to replace the rest of the news system, just as Trump is trying to replace the media so that news about Trump comes from Trump. So exit, voice, and loyalty used to be the options available to people when they were dissatisfied with the news system. Now they have attack, pollute, and replace, because the internet makes all of those easier and much more doable. And it's not just the United States. This is happening in UK, it's happening in Turkey, it's happening in Hungary, it's happening in other European capitals. And I'll just finish with this remark. For some reason that we don't understand, reality has become a weaker force in the public sphere, in our politics. And this is where I think people in my business, academics who study history, political science, modern society, haven't done a good job, because I don't really think we know why that is. And it certainly has something to do with media, but it's much bigger than media. And it's not like everyone was always so reality-based before, because we always had propaganda, we always had entertainment, we always had fantasy, we always had the manufacture of illusion. Those things go back a long time. But there's something in our politics today in the West that has, to Putin's delight, weakened reality as a constraint in democratic politics. I don't know why that is, but I'm looking forward to learning why that might be.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you. Maybe we could start a discussion by plunging into the last point, because it seems relevant to the three of you. What has happened to truth? What has happened to reality? Is it something that we as academics maybe are responsible for, in part, with our post-structuralist, postmodern theories that first have questioned the existence of an objective reality, right? Starting in the 1980s, does that have something to do with it? And how does it relate to Donald Trump, who we probably all agree has not read Baudrillard? So do you have any thoughts on that as journalists, but also as academics? Masha?
No. I mean, I have thoughts, but I think the answer is no. It's not the academic's fault. In fact, I think that argument is an example of turning something on its head. I think that theory in the 80s and 90s was actually an exciting group exercise in trying to make our shared experience of using language more nuanced. And trying to express things that were difficult to express, and trying to arrive at shared realities. Right? It is the exact opposite of what we're living through now, and I think we just have to be really aware of the way that it's that argument perverts the entire exercise. I think I have an answer to what's happened to reality, and I think that answer is actually found in the writing of earlier theorists. Hannah Arendt described the way that ideology, encapsulated ideology, ideology that proposes a simple idea that explains the entire world, the way that it appeals to a homeless, rootless, scared human being, because it is easier for the mind to live with than the messy reality that we encounter. And I think that we're living through a period of reality that is so disconcerting that simple explanations become extremely seductive, and they just work extraordinarily well. I think this is not the first such period in even recent human history.
Well, to take this in a slightly different direction, one of the things I've studied a lot as a journalism professor here at NYU, who is not a practicing journalist, but I have a PhD in media studies, is the whole nature of the claim of American journalists, and this would be true of people at the BBC in Canada, BBC in England, CBC in Canada. The kind of claim that they traditionally have mounted, which comes down to we don't have an ideology, we don't have a philosophy, we don't have a starting point, we don't have assumptions, we don't have a religion, so believe us because we are just telling you the facts. And that is why you should believe us. There's something about that claim which was very potent to them, very convenient in some ways, had a commercial logic, had a certain cultural authority. There's something about that claim that has like hidden traps and weaknesses in it. If you say to me, I don't have any beliefs, I'm just telling you the way it is, and that's why you should believe me, the first time I can identify a belief you're attached to, I can crash your system, right? So it's very vulnerable to criticism. And this is what Agnew picked up on in 1969, and that's like a crack in the system that the right wing has exploded into an entire political movement. If you say to me, I'm objective, every single thing I can see in your performance that isn't objective undermines you as a professional. And our political journalists especially are completely deaf to this. They don't seem to understand this at all. So they helped create this entire movement, which is still powering itself behind the claim of bias, when a much more human approach to journalism would be, instead of what I have called in my own criticism, the view from nowhere, which doesn't make any sense and cuts against the entire history of 20th century philosophy, not to mention the 21st century. Instead of taking the view from nowhere, a simpler, more rational way to approach it would be to say, here's where I'm coming from. Here's where we're coming from. And to add to that, here's what our reporting has found us, has told us. So that combination of here's where we're coming from and here's what we have discovered in our reporting, to me, is much more potent than we don't have a view, we don't have philosophy, we don't have an ideology. But our journalists, to this day, even though they've created this incredibly destructive counter-reaction to that idea, are still stuck in this frame where they can't stop saying this, especially, for example, on CNN. So that has been disastrous, and it's also helped to wear away at a sense of reality, because when you have to have people from both sides disputing everything, pretty soon the audience can conclude from that nothing is true.
Marc, do you feel these constraints that Jay just described in your daily work? What would your editor say if you proposed a topic? Let me tell you how I come at this with my experiences, and these are my biases, and I'm going to tell you now what happened.
I think in my case, we have a lot of freedom to do that, but I don't ever want to be perceived as telling my readers what I think is they need to know, because then they tune off. I mean, I agree with a lot of what you guys said, but from a practical point of view, why is this happening right now? What are the conditions now that make all of this come to a head? And what you said about people reaching for simplistic explanations and truths when they're feeling disoriented, when there's a lot of fear, when there's a lot of confusion. It's the same thing like religion. You believe in something that you have no proof for, just because somebody tells you. I don't want to offend anybody, but the things we believe in, religion is something we reach for when we have no explanation, when we're lost on our own. And I feel the same thing is going on right now, and this is what Trump and Fox News have seen. At the same time, I wonder, why is this happening here so much more than we were talking about this earlier, than it is happening in Germany, to bring a little German point of view into this. It has a lot to do with the structure of the media and how they came about in this country. I think it also has to do with the civic society in this country as opposed to maybe in Europe, where education is going down. Education is just really, if you go to a high school here, I mean, universities are great if you can afford them, but if you go to a public high school here, you don't learn anything about history, you don't learn anything about context. And I think that's why people, it's harder for them to spot the crazy untruth that they're being presented. It's easier for them to eat this up than it is, you asked me earlier why Breitbart hasn't taken root in Germany yet, even though they're trying, because I think there's a lot more historical awareness and just political context there. And the whole thing with Fox News always baffles me, that whole discussion about the mainstream media, because I don't know what that means. What is the mainstream media? Fox News is the mainstream media, if you look at the ratings. So why doesn't anybody point that out? Why do they get away with saying, you're mainstream media, we're terrible, and we're going to tell it how it is? Well, you're the mainstream media. I think it's one of these terms that have become meaningless, like fake news has become meaningless. Like you wrote about this recently, about the language, how when words don't mean anything anymore. they can be turned against us, and we have no common ground anymore. And this is why, as a reporter in my daily work, it's not about what I think and where I'm coming from. You know, I got into this profession because I wanted to tell stories of people, and that sounds so naive now in hindsight, and so wonderful. Thank you for that. And it's so much more. And I learned that, and this is the point where we really have to say, this is so much. What do we do here? We're not just telling stories of people who do this and that. We're not just, as a German, we're not just writing about, oh, look at those crazy Americans. I've covered 6 presidential campaigns, and it was always like that. It was always like, oh, look at the system and look at the primaries. Oh, we're in New Hampshire and the fairs in Iowa, and it's so much more. This is the core of who we are as people in politics, and there is nothing that's not political. My job is political. So I don't have any answers, but I feel like my editors, bring it back to your questions, my editors definitely give us the freedom, and I feel very lucky with that, to write, try new ways of explaining. And it's not enough to just go talk to more Trump voters, because there's nothing new there, really. And I'm not going to convince any Trump voters by what I write. It's the voice that has to change, and how we talk to our readers. Yeah.
Right. Well, if we don't have the answers, then let's go back to theory. Masha, you mentioned Hannah Arendt. Distortion of reality as a means for people, scared people, to make sense of what is happening. I will now present you with a false binary. Can we win those people back? One possibility. Or is this the end of democracy? Is this the case against democracy?
I don't know. We're certainly not going to win those people back through the work of journalists. That's not how it works. You can't change people's worldview by addressing them in a large public forum. That is a job for one-on-one counselors, and we actually know quite a bit about this, about how that works. So I think we just have to kind of set that aside. But I think that I could actually make an argument either way. I could say that that when democracy encounters a bad faith actor, and that's certainly what we're dealing with in Trump, as far as we know, it often, if not always, turns out to be helpless. Right? Using the tools of democracy in bad faith will almost always turn out to be a victorious strategy. But at the same time, I find conversation about how this is a product of American democracy to be disturbing and somewhat misguided. This is a product of not tending to American democracy. This is a product of complacency. This is a product of an antiquated electoral system that has been left in place because we're all convinced of American exceptionalism and more perfectness, and it's also a product of the last 16 years of life in a state of emergency, in a state of mobilization, of ongoing concentration of power in the executive branch, which has changed the understanding of what the president is and allowed somebody to run for autocrat in this country and win quite narrowly, but still win. And so, I think that using the example of the Trump election as an indictment of the democratic system is intellectually dishonest. it's an indictment of American overconfidence.
Kristen, could I reply to that? Hannah Arendt was a huge influence on me as a graduate student and as a scholar here. One of the things I took from her work was that the Jews in Germany before the war were, I think she says several times in her works, unable to think politically about their situation. And the point she was making was that they thought of themselves as good Germans. They thought of themselves as good citizens. They were unable to get outside themselves and see that there were political uses of their otherization that could be deadly to them, and that by failing to think politically, they couldn't even save themselves. So Marc said earlier that my profession is a political activity. Like we are engaged in a sense, political work. In the American tradition of journalism, once you realize that your profession is in a sense political, there is nothing further beyond that. American journalism doesn't instruct you in what to do with that identity. It doesn't tell you what your politics should be, could be. And to this day, right now, if we recognize, and journalists recognize, that our democratic institutions are under attack, they are crumbling in a sense right now. And we asked our journalists, is it your job to defend those institutions? They would say, I don't know. That's not really our responsibility. Because they cannot think politically. That's dangerous. That's what Arendt was trying to say. If you lose the capacity to think politically, you could lose your life. That's the situation our press is in today.
Masha?
I agree with everything you've said, Jay. I just want to make a footnote. There is an American tradition of journalism that is political. And that's, I come from that tradition. I came of age. No, I'm not talking about the opinion pages. I'm talking about, I came from the gay press. It was a movement press. There was a black press in this country for a long time that was a political press, right? We never thought of ourselves as impartial observers, because who can afford to be an impartial observer when everyone you know is dying, right? I got my start as a journalist in 1980s covering the AIDS crisis, which the mainstream media, and that phrase is meaningful when I use it in that context, which the mainstream media wasn't covering. And I was highly aware of the fact that everything I did, including teaching myself to read medical papers, was a political act. And I think that when we talk about what American journalists can do now, it's actually very useful to look not so much at the experience of other countries, but to look at the experience of this country and of the of newspapers like The Defender, of which there's a terrific history out, and of the gay press in the 1980s and 90s, to learn something.
Marc?
Yeah, I also want to respond to that. To both of you, like you said earlier, I went to journalism school in Germany and here. And the other very good university. And the biggest difference that struck me, and that they sort of hammered into us, was that point: do not be political. Exactly. You cannot vote, or you cannot tell anybody how you vote. Imagine that. And I was completely baffled by this, because when I went to journalism school in Munich, it was the opposite. It was, you became a journalist to be political. You wanted to be political. You wanted to make a statement. You wanted to make a difference. The whole idea of objectivity, and so it's very interesting to hear that, but what you said about the minority press, I think they're very, very important here more so than in Germany. I don't remember them, us having them over there. And I think those are also the points where we now can maybe find a common ground here, that we have to be the voice of the people who don't have a voice in this, because it's not about just what happens in Washington. It's about what happens to the GLBTQ community. It's what about happens to people of color. It's what about people who don't have a voice and are weak and powerless in this country. This is the story that's not really being told here right now. We get all caught up in the big scheme. Meanwhile, we talked about this earlier. Meanwhile, Jeff Sessions pushes through, reverses justice reform of years and years that now goes back to, the 1960s. Meanwhile, it's just, so I think we're on the right track here, but the education of a journalist, if that still exists, I don't even know that anymore, but is very different in at least my experience from Germany and from here. And one little point about the Jews, let's not just describe them as victims completely. I agree with you that a lot of them were completely unaware of what was going on, but there was also not enough that were aware and that were very politically active, especially, if you come from the university in Munich, the resistance there, just these people didn't have the support of, a broader megaphone of people who spoke for them.
I know we want to go to the audience, but I just want to make one point in response to Mark. American journalism in its mainstream variety, which Mark would have learned about at Columbia J School. Yeah. American journalism is not only capable of denying the traditions that you come out of, the gay press, the black press, the labor press, the radical press, and kind of pushing that to the side as if it wasn't part of their history, which they do all the time. But it's also capable of believing simultaneously we afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. We are the voice of the voiceless. We stick up for the little guy. People at Columbia J School would be totally comfortable with those kinds of sentiments and simultaneously teach you to say, we don't have any politics, don't vote. We are removed from the political arena. Now, the only way that you can believe both of those things simultaneously, which they do, is to reduce your own thought to superficiality. That's the only way you can do it. You have to skate on the surface. And that is part of the reason why the journalism profession was totally unprepared for the political genius and wizardry of Roger Ailes when he created Fox News, for the entire culture war attack on mainstream journalism, which has been so successful, and even today, for the way Trump both simultaneously discredits and attacks them, and flatters and attracts them at the same time. It's like a puzzle they can't figure out because they have an almost willed superficiality to their own political thought, which begins way back before they're ever on CNN or on the front page of the New York Times. It begins with their education, and that's a problem.
Thank you very much. I would now like to open it to the audience. Are there any questions, comments? Yes, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Bring the microphone. Okay, who's first?
So the lady.
Okay, right
here. I was curious when you said it in the beginning about election night, and your first thought was, how had we failed? And I was wondering, did you mean had we failed not to know that this would happen, or how had we failed to keep it from happening? And because one thing I keep thinking now is when Trump was allowed to, someone who had been discrediting the first African-American president for 8 years, why didn't anyone say, what does Make America Great Again mean? Because it clearly means Make America White Again. And why didn't anyone say that? I don't know. It's just, so that was one thing I thought, but is from what I'm hearing, is that the job of journalism? Or he should have been nailed on that more, if it could have been done. And I guess the other thing, I read, I've been thinking about ways of addressing him. I read by Leon, I don't know how to say it, Leon Feuchtwanger, something he wrote in 1933, The Oppermans, and when he refers to Hitler, he always says, he never says his name, he always says the author of the book, My Struggle. And I was thinking that was a deliberate way of not, I don't know, I'm not sure what it was, but anyway. So I guess the first thing, how did you fail? I mean, was it that there was so much focus on a meaningless kind of scandal about emails, but not so much on a racist and all his followers being racist until after the fact? I don't know.
Thanks. I do agree with you that it is the job of the media to point out that Make America Great Again means Make America White Again. And it should have been. And I think that's more a question for the American press, because I have to say, our magazine, we did point that out. We did write about that, but that doesn't matter here. The only thing that what we do matters here is if we have a controversial cover about Trump, right? So when I said I failed, I was more thinking, I did not see that coming. So that really means I know shit. I don't know anything anymore. It was more a question to myself. And we did have two versions of the election story that night, but we did also put more effort in one of those two versions, and that was not the version that came out. So it was more a personal failure also, that we can't prevent anything like this, and it's probably not preventable, but did we see the signs in Middle America? Did we go to Ohio enough? Did we go to Wisconsin enough? And you know what? We did. We went to all these places, but the failure is more, I think we needed to be cut down a little bit. We were on a very high horse as reporters and journalists before, I think. And I think it was a reality check for all of us. And I turned that into a good thing for me. Like with any thing that happens in your life that is not the way you want it, or that is a shock to you, you turn it into something, what you learn from this. And so I do agree that it is the job of the press. But again, you have the whole political thing. The American press, they're so, well, if we say it means that, we also have to say it doesn't mean that. If we say climate change is real, we also have to say climate change is false. That whole stuff goes out the window now. And so I hope that answers your question. Thanks.
I just want to add a little bit. And one fascinating story that, for obvious reasons, we're not reading is the story of that would really explore the theory of how Russian influence in the election worked. Right? We see a lot of coverage of the hacks and the possible collusion with the campaign. What we don't see is that the actual theory advanced by the intelligence agencies in the joint report in December was that Russia influenced the American election by using the public sphere, by releasing information into the public sphere information with which the New York Times ran, the Washington Post ran, and ran immediately, ran without a second's thought. I mean, as soon as WikiLeaks published those emails, the New York Times was out with a cover story. I've talked to a lot of journalists about this, and most of the time I encounter this completely blank lack of understanding. Like, it's out there. We didn't put it out there. Of course we cover it. Like, but you're supposed to think of yourself as a political and ethical actor and ask whether you actually picked up this thing that someone put out there, right? But we don't even have the tools to have that conversation, so we're not having it.
Two related things. I want to start with the practical. I appreciate your pointing out the way the media will manufacture two sides to every question when, in fact, there aren't two sides. There's another point, which is not about just the point of view, but it is about what is covered. And that is a deeply political decision. I'm a historian, and I know that our choice of topics already says something both ethically and politically. But there's one thing behind this problem that none of you have mentioned, and that is the funding of American journalism. And what, well, you know, it's not so much that I'm asking you to tell us the problem, because I suspect we all know much about that, but if you have thoughts about how to combat that, including the possibility that journalists themselves need to talk about the funding of the very organs that they work for.
Jay, is that a question for you?
Sure. It's very true that because our media system is funded mostly by commercial means, this is one reason why we have this formula of quote-unquote objectivity. Part of it is the commercial logic of trying to piss off the fewest people, right? That's how you get, on the one hand, on the other hand, journalism. That's how CNN thinks. It wants to be in the middle. It wants to be neither this nor that. And there's a commercial logic to it. And we don't have a strong tradition of public funding of media, as they do still, even though it's under attack in the UK or Australia or Canada. And so we have professional journalists who are, on the one hand, dedicated to a code of practice that has public service at its core, but they work for organizations that have shareholder value at their core. And rather than face the conflict between those two things, they allied that. So that's why it's hard to criticize them, because they keep switching logic from the commercial to the political. So how do we get around this? Well, one of the things I'm dedicating myself to over the next year is bringing a Dutch organization, news organization, that's succeeded very well in the Netherlands to the United States. So their model, they're called the correspondent. They are funded completely by their members who believe in the journalism they're doing. They started with a crowdfunding campaign that gained them 18,000 members willing to pay for the concept of this independent journalism. They now have 56,000 members who are paying 65 euros a year. They have a $3.5 million editorial budget. They have 21 full-time correspondents. They have a renewal rate of 80%. All of their money comes from members. They have no ads, no sponsors, no clickbait, no headlines misleading you into clicking, no addiction to the daily news cycle, no traffic goals. And the members are not only financially supporting the news organization, that's part of it, but the 21 full-time correspondents are required to work with the readers and draw knowledge and contacts and suggestions from the readership to improve their journalism. And it's that interaction between the readers and the writers that gives people a sense that this organization is for them and that they are not only financial supporters of it, but participants and members of it. And so that's an interesting model that I want to see if it can work in the United States. That's why I'm working with this organization, because I think the commercial news system has in part given us some of these problems. It's given us clickbait. It's given us Facebook and echo chambers. It's given us sensationalism and objectivity in this sort of weird mix that doesn't work for either one. And yeah, I mean, the fact that we can't, journalism is a unique public good in that it's really bad if the state supports it. And it's really bad if the private market supports it. So we have to find something that's neither nor. And that's been a problem for a really long time. It's still a problem. We're not going to solve it even with this experiment that I'm involved in. But yeah, that's part of why we have these difficulties. This is a problem that you can't solve by the usual means.
Mark, you had a thought on that?
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I mean, we haven't found a solution to that money problem. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this conversation. But for my magazine, it's a little different. We were founded after the war, licensed by the Americans, with a definite left-leaning touch, and that is still there. But at the same time, of course, now we have, everything goes through clicks and through, how do you get advertising there? But I have to say that nobody ever asked me to change a story or to not write a story or to write a specific story because of the bottom line. Nobody. Criticism of Trump has not affected our money. We have criticized Hillary Clinton a lot, also has not affected. It generates a lot of feedback, let's put it that way, with our readers who can communicate with us now directly, for better or worse. But we have never been asked to change our coverage and to create this false narrative and create that false balance. We want to look reasonable, and we want to make an argument that sounds and reads and makes sense. So you have to look at the other side. But in our case, I mean, I feel very lucky. We don't have that issue because we're also owned only 25% by a corporation, which is Bertelsmann. The other is the family of the founder, and about half is the employees. So maybe that's a different model. So,
thank you so much. I was just wondering, given the success of Breitbart and Fox News over the past few years and decades, do you think there are any either strategies or sort of financial tactics that can be learned that either the mainstream press or the left press can learn and utilize against them, or just popularize?
If you mean, can there be a left-wing Breitbart?
No, I mean...
No. There can be, but that would be a bad idea. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
What can the New York Times learn from Breitbart?
Geez, I'm not sure they can learn anything except for the fact that what I said earlier, that when you don't give people voice, they will exit. And I think the New York Times, among other mainstream news organizations, is very weak on voice. And so maybe one of the lessons of that episode is get better at that, But I don't really see Breitbart as news or journalism at all. I think it's an ideological cadre who use the forms and symbolic trappings of news to accomplish their ideological objectives. And there's a long history of that. There's many other examples of that. But it's sort of a con, that the idea that their news is a con, and it's a very effective con precisely because the quote-unquote mainstream media keeps insisting that it has no political identity. The more it continues with that claim, the stronger the Breitbarts of the world will get.
I think, I don't know if the New York Times can learn this, but we can certainly learn that we need to have a conversation about freedom of speech, right? Fox News became possible on the scale in which it became possible because of the repeal of the fairness doctrine, right? And the idea behind the disappearance of the fairness doctrine was that now that television was limitless, right? Now that you could have 50, it seemed like a very large number at the time, cable channels, you no longer needed to regulate information and speech on television the way it had been regulated, right? Network television had been, because it was a limited public resource, because frequencies were a limited public resource, network television was regulated in terms of the information and the accuracy and fairness of the information that it needed to provide. We lost that and got Fox News. Part of what gives Breitbart and other fake news outlets their traction is a similarly misguided idea that the internet is boundless and therefore there needs to be all sorts of freedom of there needs to be absolute freedom of speech on platforms like Facebook. And there is no conception of the platform, or very little conception of the platform like Facebook as a public resource, and also very little conception of the fact that even if the bandwidth of Facebook is boundless, the bandwidth of the people who read Facebook is not boundless. And we need to return to a conversation about how public speech is regulated.
I'd heard the economic argument explaining Trump, that there are so many voters that don't see the way that government directly affects their lives, that they voted for him as a middle finger to the establishment and more as a display than something to better their own situation. And I wonder if you think that applies to the media as well, that people don't see the effect that a healthy media establishment has on their lives. And so, Professor Rosen, like you said, they attack or destroy it as entertainment, and troll it as entertainment. And I wonder how you think the media could regain a sense of, or could re-earn that place in people's lives. And then just a small second question. There were political outlets like small newsletters, and I think I.F. Stone has gotten a sort of revival in popularity in recent years. And I wonder what place you see small outlets. I work for Talking Points Memo, and that's a small outlet with a clear editorial voice from one person, where you see outlets like that in this atmosphere.
Well, I'm a huge fan of Talking Points Memo. One of my students, former students, works there. I've been reading it for years. God bless you. And the lowered cost of production that the internet represents, of course, makes possible very valuable resources like that. And there are many others. It is, in many ways, is a golden age for specialized journalism, niche journalism, newsletter journalism. Those things are flourishing. Your first question was about
How do you regain trust and the importance of our work with readers who see it maybe as something?
right, entertainment. So yeah, I think one of the campaign promises that Trump has actually delivered on completely and satisfied his constituents 100% was the promise that if he became president, he would put down these people, the journalists, regularly, and ridicule them and humiliate them, which he did regularly throughout the campaign. And yes, I believe that for his supporters, there is some sort of visceral satisfaction in that absolutely makes them feel it was worth it. I mean, just to see Anderson Cooper ridiculed, just to see hatred projected at the press is some sort of political delivery and a kind of promise keeping that I think is sort of extraordinary. And this is why I think the White House press corps is completely clueless about this. This is why I say send the interns, not because the briefing is unimportant or we should get rid of it. It's not that at all. It's that when these big names, these big personalities like Jonathan Karl of ABC News sit there to receive this abuse from the White House, they are satisfying a core demand of the Trump constituency. They are becoming players in a kind of kabuki. And yeah, a lot of his constituency is totally thrilled with the put down of mainstream journalism as if that was some kind of win for them. And that is much more than any concrete policy achievement, I think, what has really cemented his support among his base, which is about 30% of the electorate. But the consequence of that is that when journalists go out and do their work, they are at most capable of reaching 65% of the public, because the whole third of the public is already gone to them before they even get to the office. And that's a big deal.
Yeah, I want to add to that, because I agree with the whole theater of public humiliation, and I think that's a short-term thing. I think it's a lot of instant gratification. And I personally, I don't need the President of the United States to validate me as a reporter, as a person at all. I don't need him to validate my outlet. And I don't participate in that. I think the stories that need to be written are not found in the White House press briefing room. They've never been found there. I don't think any story ever came out of that room that was of any importance. The stories are found outside that room. They're found through digging, through enterprising reporting, through investigative reporting. That whole game, that's great. At the same time, I laugh at the whole establishment debate, because he is the biggest establishment there is, just as Fox News is the biggest mainstream media there is. So I'm baffled that people don't get this and play along. So
thank you very much. I'm changing topics a little bit, talking about the Panama Papers, because I think they are like a good example. The Panama Papers, like that journalism also, like in the last year, surprised us with kind of an unprecedented globalized case. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and if you think that this higher degree of collaboration especially between countries, could help us move forward.
There really is a dilemma here. We have two sides, and humiliation doesn't belong only to Donald Trump. Donald Trump needs to be validated. Maybe you don't, but he needs to be validated. He doesn't want respect. He wants adoration. It's a very different thing. And I believe that the political cartooning that is being done and the parodies that are being done on television and the put-downs of him and his staff are another way of getting him upset. So he gets even more vile. What is the value of the humor? Is that helping?
I have, of course, a lot of questions, but we talked about distortion of reality. But actually, everything that people construct, even this room, it's artificial reality. It's tribal life or religion, or again, this room, it's just artificial reality. And now we have this platform. During the ages, intellectual hold power on the production and distribution of information. And now we are lost it, because anyone on Facebook, they have this platform, they learn press buttons, they can create any artificial reality, elect whatever they want, and it's only was not about Trump. It was also was about hate to Hillary, and they could distribute any kind of fake news again, create artificial reality, and make a digital revolution. For me, it seems like it's very similar to October Revolution. We just don't have blood. We don't have real victims, but we have a lot of digital victims. And journalists may be these victims who have to be killed, and new order, like in after October Revolution in the Soviet Union, should be created, whatever, and the real demos should be ruled, who wants circuses and bread and nothing more.
I'll just take the humor question, and you can probably take the Panama Papers question. I'm worried about humor, and I say this as somebody who's become a regular on the Samantha Bee show, but I'm worried that about the reasons why it's become so potent, because we're dealing with something that is absurd and ridiculous, and the only people who seem to be, the only commentators who seem to be able to regularly point out the absurdity and ridiculousness of it are the late night comics, right? It should be happening in the papers. It should be happening on CNN, and it's not. But it's not funny. And laughing at it, actually, while it may be sort of short-term cathartic, I think long-term is a little dangerous, because we've created this schizophrenic media world where we constantly validate what he is doing in the serious media, and then we laugh at it as something absolutely absurd in the humor shows, when in fact the truth is in the middle, right? It is reality that has real consequences, eventually for all of our lives. For now, just for the most vulnerable lives. And it's not funny, right? The other concern, and I'll just say this very quickly, that I have, of course, with the late night comics is that they're not bound by rules of veracity, right? They are. I mean, they do increasingly produce shows that, in many ways, resemble or use the conventions of news shows, but aren't actually news shows. They don't have to report facts. They have that option, but they also have the option of not reporting facts. And it gets very, very fuzzy, and I think that's also kind of frightening.
I agree with that, because, as I said earlier, American journalists cannot think politically. They're prevented from doing so by the codes of their profession. They can't see that they've been losing cultural authority to satirists and comedians for a long time. They are among the biggest fans of the comics, because the comics are able to say things that they think they cannot. On the Panama Papers, for the most part, political journalism is national. It's based in national political cultures. It's made possible by the law in countries where journalists operate, where you don't have a legal system that permits freedom of the press. You don't have a press. So journalism is very much a product of individual nations. But projects like the Panama Papers show that there's another way to think about it, which is everywhere in the globe there are powerful people. Everywhere on the globe there are powerful people hiding what they're doing. And everywhere in the globe there need to be journalists digging into that and showing us the real designs of power. And the Panama Papers collaboration, which is unprecedented, included journalists from I don't know how many countries, but it was like 20-something countries, shows that there is, in a way, a global press. And that's a very potent idea, because it's analogous in certain ways to other global ideals like human rights. And it shows that there is a journalism beyond national law, national culture, national traditions. So I paid a great deal of attention to it. I thought it was a very important event.
Mark, do you have a final comment?
Yeah, I agree with the Panama Papers, even though Der Spiegel was not being included in that consortium. I thought it was a great example of how we, when we work together, we can achieve much more than just being in the stupid competition over readers and clicks and viewers and eyeballs and whatnot. When it comes to Donald Trump, I think everything he does, his entire impetus and ideology, and I'm not a psychologist, but it's his ego. Everything goes down to that. The political consequences is a different story, but I think his ego explains everything. And he's, one of the first things I looked up after the elections was the definition of narcissism. Even though I have a lot of personal experience with that, it's just good to how you deal with these people. And you're right, there's nothing funny about that anymore. We had a memo sometime between the elections and the inauguration where we said, no more funny Trump stories. Trump did this, Trump did that, ha, 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 ha. No more. It's not funny anymore. But if you go back in history, a lot of the space created for debate was by comedians, by satire in Germany has a very, very big tradition politically. So I would say, as we go home here, just don't forget to laugh. Because otherwise, I think we're lost in all this. So thanks.
Well, thank you all very much.